We're doing a panel without a moderator, so we just have to be. There's a lot of pressure for us to be chatty and exciting, right?
And charismatic.
And we're going to go to questions quick. If you have a question, yell it out. Please interrupt us. You can be part of this conversation, right?
I was told that
yes.
I'm going to kick us off with a question.
Excellent.
And it is a question that I get asked every single time I'm ever interviewed about anything related to being a horror filmmaker. So the question I always get asked is, how does your identity as a fill in the blank shape who you are as a horror filmmaker? And I would love to hear all of you answer that question.
Okay, I got to go first.
Yeah.
This is a racist question. And this is like my mother said to me for Academy Award, because I never get that asked that question. You get asked that question because you're a woman.
But wait, can I just ask, are they asking what is your identity as a woman or an Asian?
Both.
Both.
Yeah, but that's what there's.
Kind of like
that's
either
why, so,
and or.
Yeah, so you get asked that. I never get asked that question, which just shows there's inherent racism in the question. So I'm going to draw a parallel to the same question. So I'm with my mother for Academy Award weekend, and she came with me to the Academy Awards, and my mother said to me, did you ask Jordan, shit, it was some African-American thing, like, did you ask Jordan, like the second thing that my mother says is, did you ask Jordan what he thought of Black Panther? And I'm like, Mom, didn't you see Get Out? Like, that's not cool. And I would say the same thing about that question. So I'm not gonna give that racist question the grace of an answer. I'm done.
Well, I guess it does speak to the problem of, it being viewed as a novelty that you're female and Asian, like, because as Jason said, he doesn't get that question. So obviously, the people that don't get that question are viewed as the norm, like, oh,
Are white men.
You're just a horror filmmaker, whereas you suddenly get it framed in the context of this thing. So I don't know what mine would be. Maybe as an Australian, but that'd be my fill in the blank.
How does that inform that teaser that we just saw? I'm still trying to process that teaser. That was amazing.
It's interesting to watch that teaser with no context. Like, what is this? What's happening here? But I think the bottom line of it is there needs to be more diversity in horror, especially with women filmmakers. I actually think horror is pretty good with diversity. If you look at like a film that Jason and I just worked on, the fourth Insidious movie, has a woman in the lead who's 70 plus. That's just not something that ever happens in the film world. You just don't see a woman of Lin Shaye's age playing the lead in a big wide release film. So I think horror's pretty good for diversity, but I think it needs more female filmmakers. Would you not agree, Jason?
I do agree. We're always looking for female filmmakers, but I think it's important not to ask that question of them. The question's answered in the work. I find that question is really, it's frustrating that you would get that question so much. That's all.
What's your usual answer? Do you have a million different answers? Do you try to change it up each time?
I do. I mean, it's hard, right? Because I love horror. I'm a horror fan. That's why I'm a horror filmmaker. And that doesn't actually have anything to do with identity. Mm-hmm. But then, by the same token, the kind of films and the stories that I'm trying to tell is actually really informed by that perspective. And so it's a little bit of a balance. I still don't actually quite know how to answer that question. I was just curious, since I get asked it all the time and I'm trying to figure out how to respond, what the experience is like for you if you were posed it. And it seems like you have a similar reaction, which is, I don't know how that works. And so
we just don't get that question. I mean, as Jason said, you don't get that question. I've never had someone say to me, like, how does being an Australian shape your view as it just doesn't come up. So it's
true. I mean, I'm on this panel with you all, and I love all of your work. And I would love to have a conversation about craft, and I'd love to have a conversation about, storytelling. But I don't, as a filmmaker, get asked that very often.
Yeah, right. Well,
but this panel's not about me.
But I think
I was just asked to set it off.
It's about you.
We have a question right here.
Maybe not so much going into gender identification or race. Would you say that if you grow up cities like New York, Hong Kong, LA, as opposed to growing up in smaller cities, the country farmhouse setting of Friday the 13th isn't going to be necessarily as scary as The Ring or something like that. Could that affect your sensibility from a storytelling perspective?
Well, I think not my locate, but my sensibility, my identity as like someone who hates Donald Trump. That's in a lot of the movies that we do. A lot of my identity is in the work that we do as a company because I like the work that reflects my politics, for instance, or my feelings about the world, or my feelings about race or sexism, or all those things I feel like are reflected in the movies and TV shows that we choose to do. So I feel like my identity is actually a lot in the work of our company.
Yeah, I mean, you can't help have your identity, whatever that is, bleed into your work. Because I feel like, especially if you're a writer, and you know, you guys would know this, you just sort of, it just sort of even unconsciously makes its way in. Sometimes, you know, maybe you go into a film and you say, I want this film to be really political. But other times you're not even intending that, and you discover later that the film is really political. Like it happened unconsciously. I've noticed a trend with me that every film I've written, this was not by design, it's always about someone who's sick or dying of cancer or some condition. I look back over my work and I'm like, this must be a really deep-seated fear of terminal illness, because somebody's always in a coma, or they have cancer, or it's always, including the film that you just saw a little scene from, which is about a quadriplegic who has a chip put in his neck that controls his limbs for him so he can walk around. So kind of who you are as a person just ends up in the work. So I'm sure for you, all your experiences and even people, the way they're treating you because of who you are, or it just bleeds in there. It gets in there whether you want it to or not.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question because I grew up watching, you know, horror movies taking place in the woods. And I grew up in New York City, and, you know, I'm a child of Chinese immigrants. And my fear, I got to sublimate my fear, right, through those movies, because the thought of being in the woods with a bunch of white folks was like, I'm gonna die. and my parents would say that too, like, you cannot go hang out with these people, you can't go to dinner, you can't go have sleepovers when I was a kid. And their fear of the world that they chose to live in as immigrants and to protect me from all of those things, I think I did actually turn to horror as a way to, in a really unconscious way, process some of that, like process the idea of being in a place that's unfamiliar and you're kind of vulnerable and you don't know where to go and you're isolated and then there's a danger, you know, all around. So that was how I identified with those movies, even though, you know, literally there was no one on the screen that looked like me, and you know.
You probably didn't even know you were doing that at the time. You couldn't.
Yes.
You couldn't get. You know, you just were doing it unconsciously.
I was.
That's something Wes Craven talked about a lot. I remember when he would talk about how, I think in the 80s when people were criticizing the violence of his movies, people would say, isn't this horrific? You know, what you're kind of putting in people's heads. And he would say, every time I go see one of my movies with a crowd, when it ends, they're flushed, they're laughing, and it's like something's been exercised. And I think there is something to that idea that, you know, we have very primal fears, and you know, horror just sort of reflects the things that we're afraid of, but there's something about a horror movie that allows us to sort of, at the same time we're confronting something head on, we're also sort of lifting some of that weight off of our daily lives.
What are yours? What's in Unfriended? What do you think are your personal, what is the personal things that you have in you that are in your work, do you think?
Unfriended specifically came from my experience researching a project I wrote a couple of years ago where I spent some time with some people in the intelligence services and found out some really alarming things about how they could access phones and all the stuff that was happening. And just when that seemed scary enough, one of them said something along the lines of, you know, but we're the government, so, you know, there are people who can do it better than we can, and the people that you really need to be alarmed of aren't us, but the you know, the 20-year-old kid in the basement who can do it better than we can and is just really, really bored. And that scared the crap out of me.
That's cool, and that's a lot of what's in the movie, yeah.
Any other questions? Does anybody? Oh. I mean, yeah, well, it depends. It's obviously that there are horror comedies, overt horror comedies like American Werewolf in London, but I don't know if you can point to The Exorcist as being filled with side-splitting humor. Although, you know what's interesting about The Exorcist? The way tastes change and attention spans, they change over time because, you know, The Exorcist came out in the 70s and I don't think people had seen anything like that and they would run out of the theatre in terror. And then do you remember when they re-released The Exorcist? Was it the early 2000s?
Yeah,
Ryan,
but
Turek, you know.
they-
In 2000, right? So they re-released The Exorcist in theatres with extra footage, like the spider walk scene. I was living in Australia at the time, and I went to see it at like a suburban multiplex, just the same multiplex suburban theatre that you would have a million of here in the US. I didn't see it at some cool inner city theatre. I just went out, and all these kids, these suburban kids, teenagers, they were there because they had heard that this movie was the scariest, and they were all cracking up laughing. And they thought it was hilarious when she's like, lick me, and it was kind of an amazing little lab rat experiment of like, wow, these kids just don't have this. And I've had the same experience showing The Shining to younger people, like a teenager who was watching The Shining in this group. Before I shot Insidious 3, I showed The Shining, and a lot of the younger people were saying it's kind of boring. And I realised that they've been recalibrated, their attention spans have been recalibrated, and they also need these little jolts. They're not used to that. So, yeah, that's been interesting.
I think it's very hard to answer your question to make a horror movie without any... it's relentless. And what comedy does in a horror movie is it lets you, relaxes you for a second, lets you catch your breath, which then makes the next scare much more effective. So I think there are a few of them. I was thinking of that... French movie, Ryan.
Martyrs.
Martyrs.
That's just not
yes.
funny.
There's no funny stuff in Martyrs. Exactly.
But I think the answer is
But
yeah.
it's very
you can.
hard to make a horror movie with not a single joke because it's so tough to sit through 90 minutes of that.
But I'm actually curious, Leigh, what you said. It makes me... The question that I have is, since, you know, looking at newer generations watching classics like The Exorcist and The Shining and having a different reaction than you remember having, for instance, right? For all three of you, what do you think is the elements that make a horror film endure over time, right? Like that makes it get into the canon as a classic that generations are going to keep watching over and over and over and over again?
I think it's just making a good film. Like if you look back over film history, when they do the lists of the 20 best romantic comedies of all time, they're really just listing 20 good films that happen to be romantic comedies. So it's like these are the best.
What makes them good, Leigh?
But I think that I guess the frustrating answer is they just need to be good films. For me, my opinion is there's no formula for making a good horror film. You just need to make a good film. And if you happen to do that, it'll stand the test of time.
I disagree.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Respectfully or disrespectfully?
Very respectfully. I think what the films have in common is they're innovative. So I think what Paranormal Activity has, what Insidious has, what even The Visit, and The Exorcist, they felt, Blair Witch felt that you were seeing something new. And what's very fun about what we all do, but also really challenging is it's impossible to set out, I'm gonna make something that feels different than everything else. Like that's an impossible thing to do. That's why it happens so infrequently. But I think the movies that go directly to the canon, Get Out, feel like nothing or very little that has come before them. That's what I think makes movies timeless.
Even if they're not appreciated when they were made, because
exactly.
his cinema history is
Just
littered
say
with like Citizen Kane, Blade Runner. For horror, John Carpenter's The Thing is the thing that comes to mind. I mean, that came out 1982, right? I just have to look at
Everybody
Ryan's
looks at
Wikipedia.
Ryan.
This is the expert right here.
Ryan.
And that movie came out like right after E.T. So everybody was really into, cuddly aliens, and nobody wanted to see that shit on screen. And now that is an enduring. I mean, that is just such a celebrated piece of cinema now. And I think that's timelessness is its ability to rise above the moment that it was made.
And there's no correlation, or often there's no correlation between box office and canon. So even movies or critics in canon, movies that at the time might not have made a lot of money or might not have done well critically, the fun, terrific thing about movies is that time is the great equalizer, and a great movie, even if it maybe didn't get good reviews or maybe even didn't do a lot of business, over time will start to get appreciated in a profound way.
What you were saying, Jason, about it having to be super original, that's what'll push it out of the... I have like 2 pieces of advice that I give aspiring filmmakers. If I ever get asked that question of like, I'm really a horror fan, I want to get into the business or the industry, I want to be a filmmaker, I only have 2 pieces that I trot out, 2 pieces of advice. One is, for me now, technology has democratized filmmaking so much. Like when I was at film school in the mid-90s, filmmaking was prohibitively expensive. Like to buy film, even 16mm film, was really expensive. I mean, you had to save up thousands, and it was just really hard. Whereas today, you can shoot a film on your iPhone, you can edit it on a laptop. Usually, so my first piece of advice is just go make something. You don't have to move to LA and sleep on someone's couch and go through this traditional. Why are you doing it the traditional way when you can actually make stuff now? Like in my area, you couldn't do that. You did have to go to the gatekeepers hat in hand and be like, please give me some money so I can shoot this script. Now you can just go and do it. And then the other piece of advice that I have is just make it original. And I wanted to throw this to you guys because I feel like the horror community is so great because there's so many really, really passionate horror fans. But fans sometimes make fan-driven movies. Like, I'm going to do my version of Night of the Living Dead. And I always want to say, no, that's been done. Like, that movie's already been made. Your little tribute to that isn't going, unless it's Shaun of the Dead and you have some crazy angle, but try to come up with something no one's seen before. If you shoot that on a Canon 5D camera or whatever with your friend and edit it on your laptop and submit it to festivals and it's truly original, people will pick up on it. And you don't need movie stars. And unlike other genres, you don't need a lot of the side salad that other movies need. Jason was at a panel earlier talking about comedy, and he was saying it's a difficult genre because you really need Will Ferrell. The audience is like, well, I'm not going to see a comedy unless I'm guaranteed to laugh. Whereas horror's not like that. No one really cares. There was a Sundance movie, Hereditary. It's a new horror film. It's coming out mid-year. People in the horror community are really talking about it, and it's got nothing to do with Toni Collette. The reason they're talking about it is because it's supposed to be really scary, and it's supposed to be original. So I don't know, is this similar advice that you guys give to aspiring filmmakers, just about originality in the horror genre?
I mean, I'll say that I don't know that I'm in a position to give aspiring filmmakers any advice, but I do say that for myself, I try to make it as personal as possible. It doesn't mean that my movies are autobiographical, but I think it goes to this notion of innovation, which I might flip and say it's about vision. And vision comes from having a voice. And so as a filmmaker, it's a craft. You have to practice it. You have to find your voice. You have to hone it. And I think that I really connect with what you're saying, Leigh. Like, you could reduce any genre into a formula and then just reproduce the formula and know, particularly in horror, there's going to be an audience. And there's comfort in the familiar. But I think that there's also so much to be had, particularly if you love horror, to keep trying to find, what makes something new. And I think that the way we all know that there's only 7 stories, and then we're all telling different variations of 7 stories. So then you got to lean into the variation, and how do you find the variation?
Yeah, it's
that's
like, what's
true?
your little twist on it?
So
but I
what's
mean,
your
if you graduated from film school yesterday, do you think you would go immediately out and try to make a film? Would you try to do it independently with your own, get a friend and try to and do that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go to film school, and so my film school was being on set and making things with my friends. and just learning that way, and then studying films and filmmakers. And so film school would have been amazing, but also there's also this benefit of not having gone to film school where I feel like I'm constantly trying to put myself in a film school every day. And living in LA, you get the benefit of that to a certain degree. But for sure, I think there's just different ways to practice your craft. And however you do it, through film school or not, no matter what, you got to make stuff. You just got to.
Yeah, you got to keep, and you can make stuff these days because of technology. You couldn't really in the 90s. You couldn't. I mean, did you go to film school, Stephen?
Yeah, we were at school at the same time.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Guys,
So did you?
You went to the same school.
Same. No. Which film school did you?
USC.
Oh, okay, cool. And did you? I was on the other side of the world.
Yeah, you're on the
film
other side of
school
the world.
No one cares about.
This is a fun reunion because we had, when my first movie was made, was the same time his first movie was made. My friend was shooting a music video in a warehouse, and I went to go see it, and there were all these "do not enter this area" signs because there's this weird movie called Sxsw being shot here. And that was the first time I was exposed to you. And then my manager said, "Oh, I'm the one producing that movie." And then the night that my movie The Grudge came out, Leigh and James Wan were there, and their movie came out. It was the weekend after?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, like we kind of had these weird movies that were very similar in that they were very low budget and they were really out of the box, and I think nobody really knew if anything was going to happen to them. But and kind of going back to what Leigh said, the fact now that we don't need permission to get those tools anymore. Like you could go to that warehouse with your Canon 5D and you could make that movie.
Yeah, now, I feel like if I was growing up or coming up in this era, I would totally be leaning into that. Like, let's grab even an iPhone. I mean, what do you think, Jason? Like, you're getting people all the time asking you, what's the best way to get into the industry? Would you say the same thing to?
Yeah, no, I
people?
agree. I agree. You can really, the best way to get better at making movies is to make them, not talk about them. That's what I always say. Same thing as you. Yeah.
Yeah, film school for me, being of that era, was a lot of talking about it, and you were just kind of trying to get into the right class where they would let you actually touch a 35mm camera that maybe you could afford, and you were only going to be able to afford it for 2 days, so you didn't have any time to experiment with what you were doing. And now you can wake up, put your clothes on, walk out of your house, and start shooting with your iPhone and practice that craft.
And people do. I mean, people film their whole lives and put them on, Snapchat or whatever, and it's. I think I remember that. It was always this unicorn. You would hear about people who made a film. Did you hear? Steve made a film. And the question was always, where to get the money? And I remember there was one kid at our film school who shot 35mm for his short, and no one could believe it. Like, how did he afford 35mm? And it was this... you have no idea. It was such a debacle, like getting film and how to do it, and now it's just so easy and so great. I mean, everyone in this room could walk out on the street right now with their phone and make a little short film. But anyway, more questions.
Yes, it is awesome that you can make a film, but it's also awesome you can upload it to the internet. But with all of this content coming in, how do you stand out, or how do you market your film so that it gets recognized?
It's a really good question. As someone who has made a couple of things, completely independently, including a feature, which we shot on Super 16, actually, which was crazy, honestly. And we brought it to festival. We got distribution at festival, but it didn't go anywhere. Right, and because there's so much noise and marketing is so important, and then at that point, as independent filmmakers, we were burned out, right? We had made this film completely on our own, found financing, wrote it, shot it, did all the post, delivered it to festival, even sold it, and then it was like, well, how do we get it out there? And then it does actually fall on the independent filmmaker. I don't. It's like the $1 million question particularly now with so much out there, how do you stand apart? So I feel like the best thing that you can do if you're a filmmaker is just keep leaning in on what's your vision and what's your voice.
Yeah,
I don't know that you can control the rest of it. You can do your best, and you can make smart decisions, you can make smart choices, and you can hopefully find situations where you have champions who do want to work with you to, get your stuff out there. But a lot of times the only thing you can really control is how strong your voice is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. I think there's definitely a bottleneck right now on the distribution side, and it's interesting because of the amount of content that streamers are buying. Film festivals have all of a sudden become extraordinarily important curators. 10, 15, 20 years ago, if you made a movie and it didn't get into South by Southwest, you could have an industry screening, you could sell it, you'd sell it to maybe there weren't that many movies being made because they were more expensive to be made. You get small distribution, but you could get the movies out there. And the downside about what you guys are talking about is there is so much out there, it's hard to find a home for what you have. And I completely agree with what you said. You can only control so much in this business. My wife is a writer, and she was a journalist for a long time, and now she's writing movies and TV shows, and she's doing pretty well. But I'm always saying to her, like, you have to work as hard as you can, put your heart and soul in what you're doing, do everything you can to get it out there, and then you have to move on to the next thing. And I do really believe. And you might say this is because we've gotten to be a successful company, so it's easy to say that in my position. But I do really believe that if you make something great, it may take a while to rise. It may not get found, but it will. If you keep doing it, you will definitely get found. And so I agree with you. As frustrating as the distribution part of it is, eventually, if you keep at it and you're good, you will be recognized, seen, marketed, distributed. But it is a tougher part of the business.
I have to agree with that, because practically the answer to the question is, well, yeah, you can go out and shoot something, but where do you show it? The practical answer is festivals, and festivals are built to show. But the thing I agree with Jason is, it's really a myth that something great will not find distribution because there's too much stuff out there. Like, there's really not that much good stuff out there. We live in a blizzard of content, like millions and millions of hours of YouTube videos and Vimeo and all this stuff, so much more competition for eyes than there used to be. Like, it was really difficult in our era to make films and expensive, but there wasn't YouTube. So people, it was a catch-22. You had less resources to make movies, but more eyeballs were concentrated on cinema. Now you're competing with with gaming, with the internet, with so much stuff. But Jason is right. If something is really great, it will cut through the noise. People will find it. People don't ignore great stuff. So the frustrating part of it is, the frustrating answer to the question is, how do you get noticed? Make something great. Which is like saying to someone, let me tell you how to get rich, kid. Make money. And it's like, I just paid $1,500 for your business school, and that's your advice? People want the shortcut. It's like, tell me how to make money through the back door or whatever. There really is no shortcut. You have to make something great, and that's not up to you. That's alchemy and oxygen. Like, even with my film, it's premiering tonight. I'm shitting myself. I'm wearing Depends right now. It's the world premiere of my film. And as Jason has probably tried to drill into my head so many times, it's really not up to me what audiences or critics think of it. You kind of make this thing and then you throw it out, and now it's everyone else's. And it is frustrating, because if people don't feel the way about your film that you feel, you're like, oh, the world's wrong for a while. But Jason is right that the only thing you can do is get back on the horse, be depressed for a week, and then go make something else. And if you keep making good stuff.
Well, and bear in mind, too, that the cool thing about the horror community is that we're all addicts, all of us. And every horror filmmaker is an avid horror fan. And there are only so many movies, and once you've exhausted those and you've exhausted everything that's available on streaming and DVD, you're just looking for more. So people who love horror are constantly looking for good horror that's distributed on YouTube, on Vimeo. So if you make something really good, it will get seen, and then people will start talking about it, because they'll be like, okay, here you go. This is the good shit. Like, this is the...
It happens all the time. Like, some horror nerd person will come up to me and be like, have you heard about that Scandinavian film?
Well, that's what happened with Lights Out.
Shot on someone's iPhone. It cost $10, shot in a day, but it's really scary. And I'll be like, get it to me now.
Yeah.
How do I find the Scandinavian shot on a phone movie that cost $10? I need it now.
All right, I'm going to give the less rosy version of this. So this why it's I think it's more complicated than make something good and it'll be found. So we've done a few movies with Mike Flanagan, who you guys probably know. He did Oculus, hooray! We love Mike. He's a great filmmaker. He did the second Ouija movie, which was terrific. First one, not so good. Second one was great. He did. And he came to us and he said, I want to make this movie for a very, very low price called Hush. And he made it, and it was kind of I don't know how many people saw it. A lot of people saw it on Netflix. It's kind of an oddball movie. Yeah, it was a great movie. And he made it, and he really delivered on he really delivered on this movie. And we had to sell it. And I contend that if we had tried to sell it at any other time than the time we tried to sell it, it would have been a wide release. But we sold it. We didn't get into Toronto, which again, you say like getting into a festival is impossible. I mean, there's 10,000 movies, 100 get into a festival. So even getting into a festival is hard. We don't get into Toronto, not unusual. We as a company had 6 movies we applied to Sundance just to give you guys some idea. We had Whiplash in Sundance. We had Get Out in Sundance. All 6 were rejected. So it's a funny story. We actually rented a big house because I was like, we're gonna have so many movies in Sundance. We didn't have a single movie in Sundance, and I was desperately trying to sell the house on Airbnb or whatever. We didn't sell the house, so I had a very expensive Sundance. So anyway, back to Hush. So it doesn't get into Toronto. So we have a screening, which I'm still agitated about this, as you can see the way I'm leaning up. So we had a screening. Friday night of Sundance, and this was my brilliant idea, which didn't work, which was, listen, all the buyers are going to be at Toronto. All the buyers are going to be at Toronto anyway. We'll do it Friday night. We'll rent a theater. We'll recruit the theater. I tested the movie. The movie tested great. The movie should have been a wide release. We invite all the buyers. This is after I've produced 500 hit horror movies. And also, I've been doing this long enough that the buyers know I'm pretty objective about the movies that our company does. I'm the first one to say, hey, listen, this one more of 10 screens. This one more Netflix. This one should be a wide release. And I call all the buyers and I say, this one should be a wide release. Mike killed it. And it's immediately discounted because the buyers hang up the phone and I know what they say is, oh, well, Blum's calling us, but it didn't get into Toronto, which is like, are you kidding me? So anyway, so they come. And the other thing that happened is we had 3 movies over the summer that didn't work. One of them was Gallows, which was ours, which didn't work. So even though we had a gazillion hits, the last movie we did was not a hit. And there were 2 other movies that didn't work. So everyone came out of Hush, horror is soft, not for us, da-da-da. We sold the movie. We did very well. Luckily, Netflix bought the movie, and all the investors, made a little bit of money, and the movie got very much seen on Netflix. But to your question, I know that was a long story, there's a lot of other factors at work, and luck and everything else. But to your point, Mike Flanagan just kept going. The Hush was not a coincidence. He's so talented that eventually his work burst through. But it does take not only making one great thing, but really keeping your voice and keeping going and having faith. And that's my my pep talk, less rosier version.
When you say that
the cream does not always rise to the top on an individual basis. Over the course of a career, yes.
But I respectfully have to offer that.
Yes.
Here's my counterpoint.
Yes.
You may say, okay, the cream doesn't rise to the top. Hush didn't do what it is. But according to what Stephen was saying before about there being this race of time, I heard about Hush from people saying, you got to see this amazing film on Netflix. And I think Hush over time, because it is this great movie, is going to, it didn't win that short-term race that you wanted to win, but it is going to win the long-term quality race. So when I say...
I agree with that.
When I say things great always rise to the top, I don't necessarily mean they're going to blow...
It might take 10 years.
It might take 10 years.
Okay.
And even if it's not even if it's a little scene movie, as Stephen pointed out, people talk about it. Someone told me about Hush, and I love Mike Flanagan. I didn't even know he made Hush. And they were like...
See, that kills me when I hear that.
I didn't. I mean, but this friend of mine said, you got to see Hush. And so I'm at home with Netflix. My wife and I put it on, and it scared the shit out of us. And we were like, what a great movie. Why wasn't that, maybe it's timing. Like, did Don't Breathe come out at the same time? That would have killed a little bit of Hush's. Sometimes you make Deep Impact and you're like, boys, we're going to the... And then you look over and Armageddon just came out. And you're like, oh, fuck. Fucking hell. Sometimes you're Deep Impact, sometimes you're Armageddon. But history will prove Deep Impact superior.
All right, we have questions.
I
We're
think
being
they're-
told that people should use the microphone, by the way.
Oh,
There's a
yeah.
little sign came up just here.
Or you. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Jason. I think there's a lot of truth in the everybody can shoot anything on an iPhone, on a
Leigh
5D
said
and that
that.
sort of thing. There's an inherent problem with production value. And Jason, as someone who's looking for voices and talent, how often are you actually watching something that was shot on an iPhone at 30 frames per second for $0? And if and when you are, how difficult is it to see through the lack of production value and see an original voice?
Well, you're asking the wrong person about production value. I don't believe in production value. I think that it's something you use to augment story. That's all our movies are low budget, but we're not known for our production value. But what we're known for is what I think makes great movies, which is the words coming out of people's mouth and the people saying those words, the story and the acting. And to Leigh's point, if you have great story and great acting, the production value, the production designers and the DPs in the room will not be happy about this. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If you have amazing performance and an amazing script, look at Blair Witch Project. This product that had zero production value.
Look at Unfriended, a web camera. Like, it's a movie based around these web cameras.
Yeah, funnily enough, even though Unfriended was low budget, I actually feel like it has actually quite a lot of production value.
No, it
I don't
has
know
that.
why that
But
is.
it just-
That's because of Andrew Westman, our editor, who's sitting
There
in the
we
high
go.
back there. He's the reason why.
But the way,
you're
you
right.
do it is this innovative. You use web cameras to make a whole film. Like someone, it's not a fancy way of making.
You
a
have
film.
to choose. Other thing is that you have to choose a story that can be shot that makes sense. You can't shoot an action movie on your phone. I mean, you have to choose because it's going to look bad. You have to choose a story that really makes sense to shoot on a phone. But there are a lot of stories that really do.
I think
And
self-imposed limitation. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I would also challenge the idea that shooting on an iPhone means that you can't have production value. I think, like having good story and great performances are just two of the major components of making really good films. And the other component I would argue that's really critical is how cinematic is it. Cinematic doesn't mean you have to have expensive equipment. You just have to make choices, be intentional about your framing, and know the limitations that you're working with, and you can still extract something beautiful. I'm a firm believer, and I strive in everything that I do to be as beautiful as possible and not be limited out the get by the amount of resources I have to do that. Because as a filmmaker, it's a visual medium, right? And at least for me as a filmmaker, the reason why I choose film is that I express myself visually. That's going to be as important to me as a really solid story and great performances, and you can get that. You may not get, you may not have these crane tracking shots with, like a period piece, and incredible, special effects, but that isn't what production value only is. I would say that you can make cinematic choices
100%.
on no money.
I can always tell I'm working with a first-time filmmaker when they're talking. You have an hour to talk about the movie, and 90% of the movie is how the movie is going to look, because that's what you can control. So that's what's fun to talk about. But that is ultimately not what gets people to go see your movie.
Yeah, like that film, the Tangerine that came out, the Sean Baker film was all shot on an iPhone.
And it was awesome, and I saw it.
was
To answer your question.
And as you guys were saying, because you have to know why you're shooting it on the phone. So he was making this like gritty, drama/comedy about these people living on the streets of Los Angeles, and so the phone medium, he really made it suit the material. You won't, as Jason said, you can't shoot Fast and the Furious on an iPhone, but you can shoot a film like Tangerine, and you can make a really scary horror film. You can do a horror film like Blair Witch.
Well, Unsane.
Stevenson.
Unsane is coming
Your
out in 2
movie.
weeks, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the star of my movie, Colin Waddell, is in Soderbergh's movie that's coming out in 2
Is
weeks.
that
that was shot-
Unsane? That's all on
Unsane.
an iPhone, is it?
Yeah, he shot the whole movie on an iPhone.
Yeah.
Soderbergh.
I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just so much proof out there that you can do this.
And I think it really lends towards horror because I think by having those kinds of restrictions, self-imposed or financial, it forces you to innovate, which might produce the ability for your material to rise above the rest.
And also going back to what Leigh's point is, I mean, I bet your selfies look great and your shots on Instagram look great. So there's a part of me that's like, oh, well, and I agree with you completely. You must have a really good story. You must have a really good story. You know, a movie's gonna fall apart if you don't have a good story or you don't have good performances. It'll still hold if you have that and it looks like shit, right? It'll still hold. That's true. But I just don't believe now that you can't make something visually interesting at the same time.
I agree. In the back?
So the advice that you've given aspiring filmmakers is to just go out and get it made. Do you have a similar advice for screenwriters? Go find someone to make it, or do you recommend a different approach?
You want me to go? I have very specific advice. Find someone who has a little bit more experience than you have and work for free. That's my advice. I tell it to my wife all the time, and I'm so frustrated by the, I think, terrible advice that she got. Not anymore, but starting out. When you're starting out as a screenwriter, find someone who's got a little more, any producer is looking for free writers. Find a producer who's produced and go write for them. Rather than writing something on spec or thinking about the business of writing, go find someone who's got something done and say, give me your art, give me anything you want, I'll write for you for free for this. So much better doing that than writing something on spec and hoping for the best. That would be my advice.
Yeah, find someone with your level of enthusiasm who sees what you see, who's as energized as you are, and then you build a team from that.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends what you want to do. Obviously, there's different approaches to. If you really want to write for TV, there might be a path where you're like, okay, I'm better off being in Los Angeles, being near television shows and production. You could take Jason's approach, where you partner up with a producer if you can, or if you have this independent film that you've written that you're burning to do, maybe you do try to meet a filmmaker who can and try to go. There's many different ways that you can come at it, depending on what your ultimate goal is. That's really what's going to shape the path to that.
Hey, I have two questions. Jason, first of all, what advice does your wife give you?
My wife, the advice my wife gives me, oh my God, the list is so long.
What's the best one?
The best one, calm down.
Calm down. Yeah. And thank you for laughing. My second question is for everybody on the panel. Can you give us your just top 10 storytelling techniques for you as an audience member and or as artist?
I need my list. Yeah, maybe we'll reduce it to 3. Easier. Storytelling techniques. I mean, it's for me, and this stuff is also subjective, so I don't want to make it seem like I'm speaking for any other writer. But for myself, I find that there's a lot of books out there, how to write screenplays. I mean, there's a whole cottage industry of how to write screenplay books, and they're great. Like when you're first starting out, I read a lot when I was starting out because I'm like, I need to know the rules. And so you read these books and they say things like, by page 30, you must have had your inciting incident. And they reduce it to this math. And by the way, lots of Hollywood studio people still really go by that math. They'll be like, you'll get that note all the time, like, where's your inciting incident? And it's like, and it's like, I don't like mathematics. I don't like anything that's a formula. So my approach is to, it's kind of like Sonic Youth. It's like those guys had to learn how to play their guitars to play them really out of tune. First, you can't just start out of tune. You sort of need to learn it to know what it can do to play it badly. So I'm glad I read those books and now I know the rules, but I like to forget them. So that would be my advice: is don't follow any formula for what you think, how you think a screenplay should be set out. Just try to have an original voice. that stuff will come later. The most important thing is getting an original story down.
I mean, I guess for me, I'm a little bit lost until I have an idea of what it is that I'm trying to get at. Like there's lots of great ideas and there's lots of really fun, scary scenes and everything. But when I'm writing, I tend to nothing really seems to come together until I sort of understand what it is I'm trying to say. And I don't mean in a didactic sense. I don't mean like where I have a character giving a speech or anything. But it's always helpful for me to sort of understand why I'm writing this story, besides just the entertainment value. Like, what is my particular point of view? I mean, I guess a good example of this would be this movie Saw. And one of the things, people talk about, well, it was the graphic nature of that movie that made it really stand out, which I completely disagree with, and I've always argued vehemently that to me anyway, what was so magnificent about Saw was the antagonist, who was also kind of the protagonist, who was the character who was trying to provoke change in people and giving them, in his own unique way, an opportunity to transform themselves that they were prohibiting themselves from having. And I think that these things hit you on an unconscious level. I don't know if the bulk of the Saw fandom could pinpoint that. I think the diehard fans probably would. So when something lasts through time, I think it's always because there's something very specific at the center that people either recognize consciously or recognize unconsciously, and somehow just resonates. So I think whether it's horror, whether it's comedy, or whatever it is, for me, I kind of like to find what is that point of view that lives at the center of this, and why does that make you think about it for years and years and years after you've seen it?
Yeah, picking up on that, I think there's story math, and then there's when you're writing a story, the sort of alchemy that happens, it's unconscious, it's magical, you can't really quantify it, and you kind of have to lean into both. And so for me, what that means as a storyteller is I do start with story math sometimes, right? Because even if I am completely animated by a particular idea, you still have to kind of look at the beats, and you still have to think about where the story is going. And then it's a lot of rewrites. It's a lot of vetting it with other folks, because that helps the unconscious process. And I think for me as a storyteller, I always have to know what I'm trying to say or what I'm exploring in the story. And if I can't articulate it, that means I need to keep going and keep digging, because the story's not fully baked yet if I can't say what I'm trying to explore. Because once I know that, then I can look at every scene and every beat and be able to say why it's there. It doesn't mean that it has to fulfill a plot. It could be there just to, really give us a sense of character and, visceral feeling, but I have to know why I have it included. And it all starts with being clear about the big themes and the things that I'm trying to explore in the course of the story. And then just as a small thing, I do really like to look at my scripts and think at every scene, can I get in later and get out earlier? So it's just a small thing that I like to do at some point, because the process it's like sculpting, right? Like you start with a big ball of clay, and then you just gotta whittle until you get to the shape. And it's just how I write. Like my scripts, I don't actually want them to be like long entry ramps into a scene and then like slow exits out. So yeah.
I think those answers were excellent. I have nothing to add to that. Are there any other questions? I could add, but maybe anyone else? Yeah.
You were talking about earlier with the
Someone's at the mic, I think.
fight. What you were saying earlier about, the greatness will rise. Even if it's 10 years, it will get there. That being said, Tommy Wiseau, good thing, bad thing.
Oh, shit.
Is that even is there any doubt?
Good thing. Yes, yes.
I think that the reason that I love that movie, by the way, not the movie he made, which I actually haven't seen. I'd like to see it, but
Seen The Room?
James Franco's movie. I've never seen The Room. Obviously, have to see it. But the reason that that's such a terrific story to tell is because that clearly broke all the rules that we're talking about, clearly, which is so incredible. That's why I loved James's movie. I just loved it. Because it's about everything that we're talking about, and because he was able to play a character. I really hated the idea of the movie because I thought he was going to make fun of him, and then he embraces him. And I'm watching Tommy like on YouTube and stuff. I love that guy so much, and I think that movie walks this really fine line and succeeds in making you fall in love with someone. But I think the reason the movie's such a great story is because it kind of none of those rules applied. So I think it really is an exception to what we're talking about.
The Room is actually a
way.
great film communally. If you're in a theater full of other people, fans of that movie, you'll have the best time ever because everybody yells out the lines and they bring props and.
Especially if Tommy shows up.
When
I saw it,
I'll
you
be
showed
honest,
up.
I fell asleep. So
During The Room?
yes.
Oh, really?
Because I was like, my brain is not going to really track what's happening here. This is, I mean, opinions aside about The Room, I think, like, generally speaking, for aspiring filmmakers, do not move forward with a plan to fail upwards.
Yes,
Because
exactly. I would not look at that example.
But here's what I would
What
say
to
though.
do.
Here's what I would say. I think someone mentioned before how much content there is out there right now, and there's so much stuff, and there's just so much content, and cutting through the noise is a big thing. How do you cut through the noise? And I think you really have to go for it, whatever that means. I think if you sit in the middle ground, you don't want to be blasé. You don't want to be kind of middling. You really want to go for it. And that guy, Tommy Wiseau, he really went for it.
That billboard was there for years.
But in the filmmaking, it was he had so much passion, and I think that's why the films ended up where it was, even though it's a quote unquote bad movie.
I would not use it as an example.
I'm saying.
I don't think it's a good. I would not encourage that route. I don't think it's a good route.
I'm saying have
Work for him.
have passion. You got to go for it and have that passion. Don't
not,
try
not
to.
that much passion.
But I think
You're wrong.
we have a couple more minutes.
Hey, I'm a big horror fan, like everyone in the room and in the room. I totally agree with what Jason said earlier about what makes a good horror movie, and the examples you gave are some of my favorites of the past years, and they are also original and renewing. But knowing that, what's your view on all the sequels?
My view, or all of our view?
Yeah.
I love sequels. I think sequels, for me, I love them because the bar is so low. Everyone thinks they're going to be a money grab, and most of our sequels have actually outperformed the prior movie, which is very unusual for horror. And the reason for that is because I believe in making the continuation on a sequel with the original creators, which is very rare in horror. Usually they don't do that. But for instance, the movie that Leigh and I just made, Insidious 4, and I don't mean to put everything down to money, but as a measure of trying to be creative and try and work within parameters. All of our rules for sequels are different than the originals, but I love it. For me, the difference between original movies and sequels is similar to me as the difference between film and TV, which is I get to use totally different parts of my storytelling brain for the two. So I think it's fun the challenge to try and make a sequel, to try and do better than the previous movie. It doesn't always work, but I like the challenge of it because of the tone of your question, because people come to them so cynically.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I've seen the bad version and the good version. Like with the Saw movies, I wrote 2 sequels. I did Saw 2 and 3, and I just felt like I didn't have anything to offer, and I stepped aside. But I didn't own the IP, so the producers could keep making films, and we weren't involved anymore. With the Insidious films, I've been involved in each one, and I think it's a good environment at Blumhouse to make a sequel, because they always want to make this film better than the last. So it really depends on your approach. You have to go into each movie thinking this is going to be the best of all of them, and that's what we've tried to do.
And Steven's movie is a sequel to Unfriended, and I think it's certainly as powerful, if not more powerful. It's definitely scarier than the first movie. I think that's cool. I think it's really hard to make and you have to make a sequel. It can't be so different that people are like, why is it a sequel? It can't be so similar to say you're ripping the previous one off. And I think Steven did that super successfully with the new Unfriended movie. One last question before we all go home. This is the last one, I think. We could just keep going until there's one person left in the audience. This is
Deliberately
trickling
put a
out.
ticking clock in
Just
front of us
keep going
'cause they
until
know
there are
that.
more of us than you.
Yes, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, has everything that you were talking about as advice. Toby Hooper was out there making documentaries, and then he did a short, and he just went for it. He went to college and hired some great actors. He got Ed Neal, who John Carpenter, even Rob Zombie said he should have won an Oscar for. But they did have Robert Burns. Robert Burns was the set director, and they had some good lighting crew. So how important do you think and how much time should be put on the set design?
Go ahead. Keep talking.
Oh no, I mean I think it's a function of the sort of larger picture. You know, I think I mean I can't speak for Toby Hooper, but that movie was so transformative for horror, and I think he figured out a way to create something that broke down a lot of boundaries and talked about a lot of fears that were sublimated by society at the time. But he needed to sell that because of what that story was. But I also think that's why he shot it in the environment that he shot it, because he was able to achieve a look, a feel, a texture that wasn't going to cost him $60 million to do. So I think, you know, I think he was very clever about, I mean, much in the way of, you know, the original Night of the Living Dead was conceived too.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre scared the bejesus out of me. I saw it by myself at like 11 years old. I don't know what I was doing or what my parents were doing. And it literally imprinted on me to this day. And so I don't know if you can disentangle set design from the magic. You know, Texas Chainsaw Massacre is just magic. And somehow it didn't turn me away from horror, even though I literally have PTSD. If we try to put that on right now, I'm going to break out in hives and start panicking. But it's just an incredible example of just genius, masterful filmmaking.
I think it has to be in service of your story, even in that movie. When I'm on one of our movies, we're shooting for 20 days, and the DP is taking 3 hours to light a scene. It makes me want to shoot myself because what he or she is saying is the way this looked is more important than performance. Because if I spend 3 hours on one shot, it means we spent 8 hours on the acting and not 11. And so I think production design, just not to be misunderstood, is obviously very important, and the cinematography is very important. But you always have to remember, and the best production designers and DPs always do know, that that's in service of your storytelling and of the actors and of the performance, and not competing with them. And as soon as you compete with them, it falls apart.
Yeah, I mean, look at, I guess Paranormal Activity is a great example for this, because Oren essentially said...
Did it all.
Yeah, but he also said what's going to make this effective is if it's a home, and he shot it in his home. Like, I don't know, you think he decorated, I don't think he dressed
He
his house.
definitely didn't.
That was just his house. You know, he just had to figure out how to swing the chandelier, you know, and pull people out of the door. But, you know, I think that there's kind of an interesting elegance and simplicity.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for
Thanks,
coming.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.